What's the stupidest thing you've ever done for a laugh? And if you're being completely honest with yourself, how close did you come to crossing the line between funny and fatal? Because here's the thing about pranks. In your head, you've already written the ending. Someone screams, someone jumps, the camera captures it all, and then everyone laughs when they realize it was fake. But out here in the real world, the people you're pranking don't have your script. They don't know you're joking. And in that second, they have to make a choice that you've already made for them. Except they're making it with their fear, their instincts, and sometimes their finger on a trigger. In this video, you're going to hear 6 stories about people who thought they were being funny, clever, or bold, and who ended up in body bags, courtrooms, or guilt they'll carry for the rest of their lives. A $1.50 Call of Duty bet that turned into a SWAT team shooting an unarmed man on his own porch. A TikTok doorbell prank that left a high school senior dead hours before prom. A YouTube stunt with butcher knives that ended when someone fired in self-defense. 4 teenagers throwing a sandbag off an overpass and killing a father who was just trying to get home. A man in a Bigfoot suit who made himself invisible to drivers and got hit twice in the same minute. And 2 kids who covered a stop sign for fun and sent 2 elderly sisters to their graves. On December 28, 2017, a $1.50 Call of Duty bet between 2 teenagers turned into a fake 911 call, a full tactical response, and a real bullet tearing through the chest of a man who had never even played the game. He was 28-year-old Andrew Finch, a father of 2 in Wichita, Kansas, and when he stepped onto his front porch that night, he had no idea that people he'd never met, in a dispute he knew nothing about, had already decided his address would be the stage for their prank. Earlier that evening, 18-year-old Casey Viner in Ohio and 19-year-old Shane Gaskill in Kansas were playing a tiny stakes wager match in Call of Duty. 1 friendly fire mistake, 1 lost match, and the trash talk moved from the game into Twitter, where pride mattered more than the actual money. Viner lashed out and threatened something most people would assume is just empty gamer talk. He said he was going to SWAT Gaskill. Now, if you don't know what swatting is, it's the act of calling in a fake emergency, usually a hostage situation or an active shooting, to get a SWAT team sent to someone's address. It's been happening for years in the gaming community, mostly as a twisted form of revenge or entertainment, and up until this point, most incidents had ended with scared families, damaged property and arrests. But no one had died, not yet. Instead of backing down, Gaskill pushed back and, in a decision that would change someone else's life forever, gave him an address, not where he actually lived, but his old family home at 1033 West McCormick Street in Wichita, where they no longer stayed. He even taunted that he'd be waiting there. But Viner didn't plan to pick up the phone himself. He reached out to someone with a reputation in the gaming community for doing exactly this. Online, he called himself Swatistic, but his real name was Tyler Rye Barris, a 25-year-old in Los Angeles with a history of bomb threats and hoaxes. He was effectively a swatter for hire, and just weeks before he'd phoned in bomb threats to a Call of Duty tournament in Dallas. So when Viner handed him the address and wanted a show, Barris didn't treat it like a joke. He treated it like a job. Around 6:10 that evening, Barris sat at a public library in Los Angeles, got on the free Wi-Fi, and used an internet calling service to spoof a Wichita phone number. He dialed and got bounced around a few times as the call transferred, and each time it dropped, he called back, insisting on getting through. Finally, at about 6:18 p.m., he landed on the line with a Wichita dispatcher, gave the McCormick Street address, and calmly started building a nightmare out of thin air. He said his name was Brian, claimed he'd just shot his father in the head during an argument with his mother, and then said he was holding his mother and little brother at gunpoint in a closet. When the dispatcher tried to keep him talking, he escalated further, saying his father was on the floor dead, that he'd poured gasoline all over the house, and that he might set it on fire and kill himself. That 3-minute 40-second call ended abruptly, but by then the damage was already done. Officers in Wichita heard an alert tone, something reserved for the most serious calls, and were told they were dealing with a man who had already killed once, was holding hostages, and was threatening to burn a house with his family inside. 10 city officers and 3 county deputies rushed to the address. They weren't a specialized SWAT team. They were regular patrol officers suddenly dropped into what they believed was a live, lethal hostage situation. By about 6:24 p.m., they had the house surrounded. Officers took up positions behind cars and across the street, rifles up, scanning the windows and the front door. One of them, 7-year department veteran Justin Rapp settled in roughly 50 yards away with his rifle trained on the entrance. Inside that house, Andrew Finch and his family had no idea any of this had been set in motion. Andrew wasn't on Twitter arguing with anyone. He wasn't in party chat on Xbox, and he'd never heard of the people using his address as a prop in their online feud. He was just at home with his family on a winter evening. His mother, Lisa, noticed the flashing lights outside and the strange activity on the street, so she went to the door to see what was happening, and Andrew followed her, trying to understand why there were suddenly police everywhere. As he stepped into the doorway, officers began shouting conflicting commands, voices from different angles, different distances, all at once. What happened in the next few seconds has been described in several different ways, even by the officers who were there, but every version ends the same way. From Rapp's vantage point through the scope, he said he saw Andrew appear in the doorway and raise his hands quickly up to about his ears, as if complying, but then drop them back down. Rapp later claimed that Andrew's right hand dipped toward his waistband or the side of his sweatshirt, that his shoulder dropped, and that to him, at that moment, it looked like a man starting to draw a gun. Another officer closer to the house said he never saw Andrew's hands go all the way up, just out in front before one hand moved down. Someone else thought Andrew might be trying to turn back and go inside, fumbling with the doorknob. To the family inside, it felt like chaos. Lisa would later say that Andrew screamed, and then there was a shot. Rapp believed he was seeing the beginning of a suspect pulling a weapon, and with officers exposed around the yard and the street, he decided he couldn't wait to find out if that impression was wrong. So he fired a single round. The bullet hit Andrew Finch in the chest, passed through his heart and lung, and dropped him on his own front porch. Officers rushed up, secured the scene, and pulled him away from the doorway, and within minutes he was on the way to the hospital. At 7:03 p.m., less than an hour after Barris first picked up the phone in Los Angeles, doctors pronounced Andrew dead. As officers cleared the house room by room, the story they'd been acting on started to fall apart. There was no body upstairs, no mother and child locked in a closet at gunpoint, and no gasoline poured through the rooms. No one in that house had seen a gun, because Andrew Finch hadn't had one. While police were still processing the scene, Barris actually called 911 again from California and tried to continue the act, insisting the hostages were still in danger, but by then officers on the ground were already realizing they'd been sent into a fiction. The argument that kicked this off, a $1.50 match, a few angry tweets, an ego bruised in an online shooter, was over in minutes. The consequences rolled on for years. Tyler Barris eventually pleaded guilty to 51 federal charges and was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the swatting call and a long list of other hoaxes. Casey Viner, the gamer who brought Barris into the argument, was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison and banned from playing video games during his probation. Shane Gaskill, the player who gave out the old Wichita address and taunted Barris, later pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. The city of Wichita also agreed to pay Andrew Finch's family a total of $5 million in a civil settlement over his killing. And yet none of that changes a simple, uncomfortable question. If you had been the one at the door that night, unarmed, confused, suddenly surrounded by police shouting from the dark, are you completely sure your hands and your body language wouldn't have betrayed you in those few seconds too? However, in Wichita, a stranger's prank put an innocent man in the trouble. But in Virginia, the setup is almost laughably simple. Ding-dong ditch for TikTok, but the result is the same. One teenager, one bullet, and a family that never recovers. What's the stupidest prank you pulled as a teenager? And if you're honest, did you ever really think about what the person on the other side of that door might be feeling at 3 a.m? In May of 2025, 18-year-old Michael Bosworth Jr. was doing something a lot of people would recognize from their own teenage years. He was out late with friends, running up to doors, ringing the bell, sprinting away and filming the whole thing for TikTok, and it felt annoying and immature but not deadly. Michael was a senior at Massaponax High School in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, a multi-sport athlete who played football, lacrosse and wrestled, and he was supposed to be getting ready for his high school prom later that same day, not lying on an operating table with a bullet wound in his chest. The plan for the night was simple. 3 teens, a phone camera, a quiet subdivision, and a ding-dong ditch trend that had been floating around social media in newer, more aggressive forms where some kids weren't just knocking and running but also filming themselves hitting or kicking doors and making it look like a home invasion for laughs and likes. Just after 3 a.m, Michael and 2 friends were moving through a subdivision in Spotsylvania County, hitting one house after another, and each time they go up to the front door, ring the bell or knock, and then sprint away while one of them filmed from the sidewalk, planning to stitch those clips into a TikTok later. Their phones would later tell that story for them. There were videos from that same night of the exact same prank at other homes in the neighborhood, and when everything fell apart, the kids themselves told deputies the same thing. They thought they were just playing ding-dong ditch, not breaking in and certainly not breaking any law that should get you shot. But the neighborhood they chose, and the time they chose to do it, meant every door they touched belonged to someone being jolted out of sleep in the middle of the night, and one of those doors belonged to 27-year-old homeowner Tyler Chase Butler. Butler lived on a quiet street, and according to what he later told investigators, he heard noises at his door around 3 in the morning and became convinced someone was trying to break into his home, and some reports say he also mentioned being worried about protecting a family member inside. From Michael's side, this was just one more house in the sequence, but from Butler's point of view, it was the only house that mattered, because he didn't see a TikTok prank or a stupid tradition from high school. He saw potential burglars outside in the dark who had no good reason to be on his porch at that hour. The teens ran up to his door, hit the bell or knocked. Accounts differ slightly on exactly what they did, but the important part is what happened next. As soon as they made contact, they turned and ran, the way you do in that prank, and as they were fleeing down the street, Butler came outside with a gun. Deputies from the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office were dispatched around 3 a.m. for what was first reported as a burglary in progress, or an attempted break-in, and when they arrived they found 2 teens injured and 1 unhurt on or near the street. Michael had been hit in the torso by a bullet, one of his friends had been grazed, and the 3rd teen wasn't physically injured, but had just watched his friend collapse in the middle of what was supposed to be a prank video. All 3 of them immediately started telling deputies the same story, that they'd been knocking on doors and running away, filming it for TikTok, and that they were already sprinting off the property when shots rang out behind them. Michael was rushed to Mary Washington Hospital, but despite emergency treatment he died of his injuries, and later coverage would linger on one detail in particular. He died on the very day he was meant to put on a tuxedo, head to prom, and take pictures with his family, and instead his parents were signing off on medical forms and planning a funeral. The sheriff's office publicly stressed that the boys were unarmed, that they said they were unfamiliar with the neighborhood, and that the surviving teens consistently described the shooting as happening while they were running away, not while they were trying to force their way into the house. Within days, they arrested Butler and booked him into the Rappahannock Regional Jail without bond, and the charges made it clear how seriously the state was taking the case. He was charged with second-degree murder for killing Michael, malicious wounding for injuring the other teen, and 2 counts of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. By later that year, a grand jury had formally indicted Butler on those counts, which meant a panel of citizens had reviewed the evidence and agreed there was enough to proceed to trial. So the uncomfortable question isn't just, why did they do something so stupid? It's also whether in that same dark silence at 3 in the morning, you would have been absolutely sure you were seeing teenagers being dumb, or whether a part of you might have seen the same shadows, heard the same footsteps, and made the same irreversible choice. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you're watching. On the night of February 5th, 2021, 20-year-old Timothy Wilkes walked into the parking lot of Urban Air Trampoline and Adventure Park in Hermitage, Tennessee, convinced he was about to film the kind of YouTube video that would finally blow up his channel. He and a friend would rush a group of strangers with butcher-style knives, make it look like a real robbery, capture the fear on camera, and then reveal it was just a prank so everyone could laugh, and the internet could share the clip. It was late. The lot was busy with families and teenagers coming in and out, and there were already cameras rolling when they chose their target. A small group of people standing near their car, talking, completely unaware that 2 young men were about to run at them with blades in their hands. But in that parking lot there was one factor he couldn't see from behind his own idea. One of the men in that group, 23-year-old David Starnes Jr., was legally armed, had no idea anyone was filming anything, and saw exactly what most people would see in that moment. 2 unknown guys charging at him and his friends at night with large knives raised. According to what Starnes later told detectives, he believed he and the people around him were about to be robbed or attacked, and when he saw the knives and the distance closing fast, so he drew his firearm and fired. Timothy went down almost immediately, bleeding out between parked cars while his friend, the other prankster, suddenly had to switch from thinking about thumbnails and titles to telling officers that the whole thing was meant to be a YouTube video. Police arrived and did what they do at any shooting scene. They secured the area, separated witnesses, and tried to work out who had done what. Starnes stayed on scene and identified himself as the shooter, telling officers he had fired in self-defense when two men armed with knives rushed him, and the surviving friend had to explain that yes, the knives were real, and yes, they had deliberately staged the ambush to look as convincing as possible. But no, they never intended to hurt anyone, they just wanted a reaction. Medics tried to save Timothy, but he was pronounced dead there in the lot, and suddenly his channel, his plans and his life all ended in the same place he thought his big break would begin. Detectives with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department's homicide unit took over and started looking at the case. Tennessee's self-defense laws allow the use of deadly force if someone reasonably believes they or others are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury, and on paper, two unknown individuals running at you with butcher knives in a dark parking lot looks exactly like the kind of scenario those laws are written for. The district attorney's office never filed charges against Starnes, and public records and news reports have never shown any later indictment or trial. On paper, in the eyes of the law, he was a man who did exactly what the statute allowed when he believed he was about to be stabbed. So the question is, if you see a stranger sprinting at you in a dark parking lot with a butcher knife in his hand, what would you have done? But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you are watching. Have you ever thrown something off a bridge or an overpass, even as a kid? Maybe a stick, maybe a rock. And if you're honest, did you actually think about what would happen if it hit someone going 70 miles an hour below? On the night of December 19th, 2017, 22-year-old Marquise Bird was riding in the passenger seat of a car heading south on Interstate 75 through Toledo, Ohio, on his way to visit friends before Christmas. He was from Warren, Michigan, engaged to his girlfriend, and the father of a young son, and his family would later say he'd been planning to propose properly soon. That night he was just talking, riding, probably thinking about the holidays or what he'd do when he got where he was going, and then at around 10:10 p.m, as the car passed under the Indiana Avenue overpass, a 17-pound construction sandbag came crashing through the windshield on his side and struck him directly in the head and neck. The driver managed to keep control long enough to pull over and call 911, and when first responders arrived, they found Marquise gravely injured, bleeding, and barely clinging to life. He was rushed to Mercy Health St. Vincent Medical Center and listed in critical condition, but the trauma was too severe, and 3 days later, on December 22nd, he died without ever regaining consciousness. His family, who had been preparing for Christmas and a proposal, suddenly found themselves planning a funeral instead, and investigators in Toledo found themselves working a homicide that had started as what the suspects would later call a prank. When police responded to the scene that night, they didn't just secure the wreck and collect evidence on the highway. They went up to the overpass itself to see where the sandbag had come from, and what they found was 4 boys, ages 13 to 15, leaving the area on foot. Witnesses and evidence on the bridge told the rest of the story. The teens had been up there for a while, throwing multiple objects off the overpass and onto the lanes of traffic below, including stones, a tire, and at least 2 sandbags. The one that killed Marquise weighed 17 pounds, which is about the weight of a bowling ball or a small dumbbell, and when you drop something that heavy from that height onto a car moving at the highway speed, the physics are brutal. The 4 boys were identified as Pedro Salinas, who was 13, Demetrius Wimberly and Sean Carter, both 14, and William Parker, 15, and all of them were taken into custody that night and booked into the Lucas County Juvenile Justice Center. Initially, before Marquise died, they were charged with felonious assault and vehicular vandalism, serious charges but not murder, and they appeared in juvenile court on December 20th facing those counts. But when Marquise was pronounced dead 2 days later, prosecutors escalated immediately, and on December 26th, just after Christmas, all 4 were formally charged with murder in juvenile court. One of Marquise's family representatives put it plainly when he said that even at 10 years old, a child understands that throwing something into a moving lane of traffic is dangerous, and that the boys didn't throw the sandbag onto the shoulder or into the grass. They aimed it down into the lanes where cars were travelling at full speed. Eventually, rather than going to a full jury trial, the teens took plea deals. According to reports from April 2018, one of the boys, the one who prosecutors said had actually dropped the sandbag that struck Marquise's car, pleaded guilty to murder, and the other 3 pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, which acknowledged that they had been part of the conduct that led to his death, even if they weren't the ones who threw that specific object. All 4 were sentenced in juvenile court to terms in the Ohio Department of Youth Services, not adult prison, because they were under 16 at the time, and the case stayed in the juvenile system. The teen who admitted to murder was ordered held until he turned 21, meaning he would serve several years in a locked facility, and the 3 who pleaded to manslaughter received 3-year commitments to youth services. But the case also didn't happen in isolation. Just weeks before, in Michigan, 5 teens near Flint had been charged with second-degree murder after throwing rocks off an overpass on the same interstate and killing 32-year-old Kenneth White. And national coverage started linking the 2 incidents as part of a disturbing trend. Police and safety experts pointed to earlier cases where shopping carts, frozen turkeys, chunks of concrete and other objects had been thrown or dropped from heights, sometimes killing or permanently disabling drivers and passengers below, and they stressed over and over that this wasn't harmless fun, it was reckless endangerment at minimum and homicide when someone died. So the question isn't whether throwing something off a bridge is dangerous, we all know it is. The question is whether, in that moment when your friends are egging you on, and it feels like a joke, you'd be the one to say no, or whether you'd convince yourself, just like they did, that nothing that bad could really happen. But what's harder to explain is what possessed a 44-year-old man in Montana to dress up as Bigfoot, walk into the middle of a highway at night, and wait for cars to hit him. If someone dared you to walk out into the middle of a highway at night dressed as Bigfoot, would you do it? And if your answer is no, what do you think it would take to convince you otherwise? On the night of August 26, 2012, 44-year-old Randy Lee Tenley from Kalispell, Montana, pulled on a military-style ghillie suit, the kind snipers and hunters used to disappear into foliage, and walked out into the right-hand lane of US Highway 93 just outside town. His friends later told investigators that Randy had a plan, and it wasn't complicated. He wanted drivers to see him standing there in the dark, mistake him for Sasquatch, and call in a Bigfoot sighting so he could sit back and watch the story blow up. According to those same friends, Randy had tried similar stunts before, but never on a highway, and that one detail, choosing a busy road instead of a forest trail or a campground, turned what might have been a stupid joke into something that killed him in less than a minute. It was around 10:30 at night, and Highway 93 is a major route through Flathead County, so there were cars moving steadily in both directions, travelling at highway speeds with drivers who had no reason to expect anything unusual in the road ahead. Randy wasn't standing on the shoulder or near the edge. He was well into the driving lane itself, dressed head to toe in a suit designed to blend into natural surroundings, earth tones and fake foliage that made him nearly invisible against the pavement and the darkness. A 15-year-old girl from Summers was driving southbound when her headlights caught something in her lane, but by the time her brain registered that it was a person, it was already too late to stop, and she hit him. Randy went down in the road, and before anyone could react or pull him out of the lane, a second vehicle driven by a 17-year-old girl struck him again. Montana Highway Patrol responded to the scene, and when Trooper Jim Schneider arrived and started piecing together what had happened, he found Randy's friends still nearby and asked them the obvious question. What was he doing out there? They told him the whole plan, that Randy had been trying to make people think he was Sasquatch so they would call in a sighting, that he'd been drinking earlier that day, and that he thought the ghillie suit would be enough to sell the illusion without putting himself in real danger. Schneider's response to reporters later was blunt and almost disbelieving. He said, "You can't make it up. I haven't seen or heard of anything like this before." Obviously his suit made it difficult for people to see him. That last part was the understatement of the investigation, because a ghillie suit is specifically designed to make you invisible. It's three-dimensional camouflage that breaks up your outline and makes you look like part of the landscape. So in daylight you blend into brush and rocks, and at night on a highway you become a patch of shadow that drivers' eyes skip right over until they're on top of you. Investigators determined that they couldn't say for certain which of the two collisions actually killed Randy. He may have died from the first impact, or he may have been fatally injured by the second, but either way he was pronounced dead at the scene, and the two teenage girls who hit him had to live with the fact that they'd struck and killed a man who had put himself in their path on purpose. Trooper Schneider made it clear in his statements that neither driver would be charged with anything, because there was no crime. Randy had created the conditions for his own death by standing in traffic in camouflage at night, and the drivers had no reasonable way to avoid him. In fact, the only surprise was that no one had called 911 about a Bigfoot sighting before the accident happened. Dispatchers received no reports of Sasquatch that night, just the call about a fatal collision on Highway 93. The story went viral almost immediately. Major news outlets from ABC to CNN picked it up, and Trooper Schneider's quote, "You can't make it up," became the headline everyone used, because how else do you describe a grown man who dressed as Bigfoot and got himself killed on a highway for a prank that never even worked? His friends told investigators that Randy had pulled similar stunts in the past, trying to create Bigfoot sightings in other locations, but those had been in forests or on back roads, where the worst that could happen was someone getting startled or laughing it off. So the question isn't whether dressing as Bigfoot and standing in traffic is stupid, that's obvious. The question is whether, in that moment when your friends are encouraging you, and the idea feels bold and funny, you'd be able to see past the joke and realize that the people you're pranking don't know you're playing, and that the split second it takes them to figure it out might be the same split second it takes for a car to close the distance and end everything. On the afternoon of August 17th, 2011, two teenagers in Pickaway County, Ohio, 19-year-old Seth Stonerock and 18-year-old Derek Greenlee, walked up to a stop sign at the intersection of Huber Hitler Road and State Route 56 East with a roll of plastic wrap and a jar of Vaseline, and they spent the next few minutes carefully coating the entire sign so thoroughly that it became nearly impossible to read. Seth did the wrapping while Derek waited in their car, and when they were done they stepped back, looked at their work, and then went straight to Facebook to brag about what they'd pulled off. To them, this was just another prank, the kind of thing bored teenagers do when they want to see if they can get away with something, and they probably imagined drivers slowing down, squinting, maybe getting annoyed or confused, but not much else. What they didn't imagine was that less than a mile away, two elderly sisters were about to drive through that intersection, and because they couldn't see the sign they'd passed 1,000 times before, one of them would be dead within the hour and the other would follow 3 weeks later. 81-year-old Jean Shea was behind the wheel that day, and her sister, 85-year-old Mary Spangler, was riding in the passenger seat. They were from Circleville, familiar with the area, and like most people who drive the same routes over and over, they relied on a combination of memory and visual cues to navigate intersections safely. But when Jean approached the covered stop sign, her brain didn't register it as a stop sign at all. The plastic wrap and petroleum jelly had turned the reflective red octagon into a blurry, unreadable smudge that her eyes skipped right over, so she kept going, rolling straight through the intersection without slowing down. Another vehicle was already crossing from the perpendicular road, the driver assuming that anyone coming from Jean's direction would stop like they were supposed to, and the two cars collided at full speed. Mary Spangler was killed instantly in the crash, and Jean was critically injured and rushed to the hospital, where she fought for her life for 3 weeks before succumbing to her injuries on September 6th. Within hours of the first crash, investigators were at the scene trying to figure out how an experienced driver had blown through a stop sign in broad daylight, and when they examined the intersection closely, they found the answer. Someone had deliberately made the sign invisible. Witnesses and tips led them quickly to Seth Stonerock and Derek Greenlee, and when detectives confronted the two teens, they didn't even try to deny it. Seth admitted he had physically wrapped the sign while Derek had stayed in the car, and Derek told officers that he'd thought it was not a good idea, but had done nothing to stop his friend from doing it anyway. Even more damning, both had posted about the prank on Facebook after they finished, turning what might have been a private joke into public evidence of what they'd done. Prosecutors charged both teens with involuntary manslaughter and tampering with a traffic control device, and the case quickly became a test of how far criminal liability extends when a prank goes wrong. Under Ohio law, involuntary manslaughter caused by a misdemeanor offense like tampering with traffic devices is a third-degree felony that carries 1 to 5 years in prison, but the challenge for prosecutors was proving that each teen's actions directly caused the deaths. For Seth, that case was straightforward. He was the one who wrapped the sign, he knew what he was doing, and he'd bragged about it online, so there was no real question about his responsibility. But for Derek, the legal ground was shakier, because while he'd been present, bought the plastic wrap, and failed to stop Seth, he hadn't physically touched the sign, and his defense attorney argued that simply being nearby and not intervening wasn't enough to make him a killer. On September 12, 2011, less than a month after the crash, a judge dismissed the charges against Derek Greenlee, ruling that there was insufficient evidence to support the involuntary manslaughter charge. Circleville Law Director Gary Kenworthy explained the decision publicly, saying that while Derek had helped buy the materials and had been there when it happened, and had even told Seth it was a bad idea, those actions and inactions didn't rise to the level of criminal participation required under Ohio law. Derek walked out of court without a conviction, but Seth Stonerock's case moved forward, and it would take years before it finally reached sentencing. In February 2015, more than 3 years after the crash, Seth pleaded guilty to 2 counts of reckless homicide, and on March 25th, he stood in Pickaway County Common Pleas Court in front of Judge P. Randall Neese and the families of the women he'd helped kill. According to courtroom accounts, Seth was visibly emotional, crying heavily as he apologized to Mary and Jean's relatives, telling them he was sorry and that he knew nothing he said could undo what he'd done. Judge Neese, in handing down the sentence, called Seth's actions childish and juvenile and sentenced him to 4 years in prison, though he indicated he would consider the possibility of early release after several months if Seth continued to show genuine remorse. The victims' families, represented in court by a victim advocate who read their statements aloud, made it clear that while they appreciated the apology, no amount of prison time would bring back 2 women who had simply been driving home that day and trusted that the roads they travelled were safe. The case became a national story, not because the prank was especially cruel or violent, but because it was so ordinary and thoughtless that it could have been anyone. Covering a stop sign with plastic wrap and Vaseline doesn't sound deadly. It sounds like the kind of stupid thing a teenager might do on a dare without thinking past the moment. But the reality is that traffic control devices exist because without them, intersections become death traps where drivers guess instead of knowing who has the right of way. And the question isn't whether you'd ever cover a stop sign yourself. Most of us wouldn't. It's whether you've ever done something equally thoughtless, something that felt harmless in the moment, and whether you got lucky enough that no one died because of it. So let us know what you think about these cases in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.